Good morning to those of you who are here in person, and good day to all those who are connecting virtually from different parts of the world, whatever time zone you're in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome you to this event, which is entitled Making Well-Informed Decisions About Solar Radiation Modification. This is being organized on the as part of the Science Summit at the UN General Assembly 78th session here in New York. And it's a joint event that we have organized with UNESCO, TERI, Energy Research Institute in Delhi, the Degrees Initiative, and C2G. So welcome. Welcome to our speakers, some of whom are online, some of whom are sitting here, and others who will join us later. My name is János Pásztor. I'm the Executive Director of the C2G, the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I will facilitate this event today. The objective of this session is to identify the gaps in making well-informed decisions on solar radiation modification and explore how to fill those gaps from different perspectives, including in particular from an ethical perspective. Why do we want to do that? Why do we even bother talking about these issues? There are so many problems, challenges in the world. Well, there are at least three reasons, but there may be more. The first is the state of climate, which is, as you all know, and as you all feel it in different parts of the world, is very challenging, and the planet is getting warmer. And at least some feel that one may need to look at options beyond the usual box, including potentially some like solar radiation modification. The second is, as the IPCC clearly says, the risks that are associated with the fact that there is no robust, comprehensive governance is a risk by itself, and things are happening. And some of those that are happening, some of them are simply uncoordinated, unconnected, which is a problem, but some are actually ungoverned and perhaps uninformed. So there are the second reason. And the third reason is that there's a lot going on. There really is a lot, and one needs to try to bring these together. So I won't say more because our speakers will address some of these issues, and it's much better if they talk than I do. But just to say that after an opening remark, we will have keynotes statements from the person sitting here. Then we'll have maybe a brief question and answer, but very brief, keeping the real substantive questions to the end. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a proper Q&A with the participants here and also those online. And then we will finish in 2.5 hours from now with some closing remarks. So that's basically our plan. And so I would like to then start, and we had planned two opening remarks at this session. I have to apologize for Salim ul-Haq from Bangladesh, who just called us literally that his internal flight in Bangladesh got rescheduled, and he's actually in the air now. So he cannot do it, but he will try to connect later on during the session and share with us his thoughts. So we just need to be a bit flexible there. So with that, I would like to ask our colleague, Gabriela Ramos. Gabriela, I think you're there. Gabriela Ramos is Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO, where she oversees the institution's contributions to building inclusive societies. Her mandate includes tackling economic inequalities of income and opportunity and promoting social inclusion and gender equality. Previously, Gabriela Ramos worked as cabinet director and Sherpa for G20, G7, APEC at the OECD. And we have worked together with Gabriela on many issues, and I really look forward. Gabriela, you have the floor, and please open our session with your thoughts about this difficult but challenging topic. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be with you, and yes, Janos, we come a long way to this very important discussion that I really wanted to be in person, but I had to come back for some very important discussions here in Paris. But the title of this session says it all. It's about making well-informed decisions about solar radiation modification. This is an area that, of course, we have been working with Janos and Carnegie, but also with Pascal Lamy on the Climate Overshoot Committee, with Laurent Subiana, all of the usual suspects that you know that have been looking at how to achieve the goals that we need to achieve on the climate transition, but also how to make sure that we do it in a way that is sustainable and that everybody is concerned in terms of inclusive discussions. I feel that these technologies, and we are now talking about solar radiation modification, but there are many other technologies that are aiming at modifying the ecosystems by a human intervention to avoid the impacts that climate change is having in our world. I think these are novel efforts, and as usual, science and technology can amaze us, because just imagining that this is possible and that we can, from the technological perspective, it might be possible that we do these kind of interventions to reduce the impact of solar rays in our world. But I feel that as the session is putting it, how are we going to take that kind of discussion? How are we going to take up that kind of decision? Who is going to take it? Who is in charge? Are we sure about it? And all of these questions, of course, are ethical questions, and are questions that need to be answered before we proceed to look into the possibilities of these technologies. We at UNESCO believe that this should be an ethical discussion. We need to go for risk analysis that is solid. And of course, we need to justify when an action is needed. We have been discussing for many months, and at UNESCO, we are preparing a report on this, our committee on the ethics of science and technology, and you have there the lead author, who is Inés Canilone. But the fact is that the whole question is, how do we frame it, and how do we ensure that all the aspects are considered from the ethical point of view? And what are the ethical point of view? The ethical point of view will include, for example, issues like the precautionary principle, whereby you need to have a good level of certainty in terms of what is these actions bringing to the goal that we are looking after. The principle of proportionality, and whether the interventions will deliver just what we are aiming at, or it will be overshoot. The question of moral hazard in the context in which we, unfortunately, is not only what Janos mentioned, that we are not really delivering what is the action that is needed for achieving the Paris Agreement, but the fact is that having recourse to this kind of interventions might also create moral hazard outcomes in which we stop focusing on mitigation. And that's why I commend the work of Pascal and his committee, because at the end, at least we need to have a pause, a moratorium, before we continue discussing the issues. We know that the framing will go into the ethical questions, but I just want to remind you, in 2017, we also have at UNESCO the Declaration on Ethical Principles in Climate Change. Ethical, again, on the question of inclusiveness, the question of bringing all the voices around, the question of diversity, the question of fairness, all of these issues that are so important. And this is what is informing the work that we are doing on these things. We cannot deny, of course, that we are not in track to deliver for the climate goals. We know that this summer was one of the hottest, and you know, every year we're saying that we have record climate extremes, no? Record fires, record floods, but every year we're having records, which means that it's just mounting. This summer it was 0.66 grades centigrade above the average from the period 1991-2020, and then all of the big catastrophic events that we have been witnessing in so many countries, and of course our solidarity is with them. The global stocktake report of the UNFCCC released at the beginning of the month is really clear. The world is no longer in track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what the main message that was really one that we should all be listening is that the window to ensure a lively and sustainable future is rapidly closing. And this impact of climate, of course, is compounded by multifaceted crises that might be related to climate, but also that are related to other trends that come with ever-changing drivers of risks and uncertainties. The war, of course, pandemics, food crisis, and underlying development challenges that keep delaying action. And we are still in the context of the General Assembly, and the fact is that we are not on track. And therefore, it brings the notion of how do we enhance our action, and how do we consider different options that could help us deliver on these very important areas. The finding these solutions against climate change and trying to mitigate its impacts, however, is not just a matter of scientific knowledge, is not a matter of political or economic drivers or technological capacities, because this is always the case, that maybe sometimes the capacities are ahead of the thinking on how we can deploy them, but it's really a discussion about our societies, the societal impact, and of course, the world that we want to build. At the same time, we know that the public and private financing for such technologies is increasing exponentially. Just the recent decision in the US National Academies of Sciences to channel 20 million research for this program in the federal government. We know that private philanthropy and foundations are also investing a lot in the research of these technologies. But we know also that is with many other technologies. We have also been talking a lot about artificial intelligence and about neurotechnologies or Internet of Things. All these technologies are presently, the research and deployment is presently dominated by industrialized countries. And of course, these raise concerns because questions of IPR, that is legitimate, questions of financing and proprietary technologies, but at the end, the deployment is going to affect the whole world, and therefore the debate needs to be global and include all the countries and the global south in particular. We need to go for diversity. We need to go for geographical and demographical representation. And many times the development of the technologies are everything but that. And this can lead to unintended consequences that we have also witnessed in terms of lack of trust in science, or the polarization that the global debate is experiencing nowadays, if we don't go for an inclusive way of handling these decisions. Because then what happens is that countries that feel that they have been excluded from the debate will simply not engage, and the solutions need to be global. We have this very recent example in my own country, because a recent unauthorized release of 2 balloons in Mexico by the American startup Make Sunsets led Mexico to ban the experimentation of such technologies in its soil. And therefore, these bans, of course, will prevent any further knowledge of how the technologies work. But we understand why countries, when they are not included in the conversation, will just take decisions to protect their own sovereignty. So it's important that we engage everybody, and that this conversation leads to a well-representative group of countries that can discuss their impact. There is also a lack of research in the global south. There is also a lack of governance on this matter. And therefore, this is the emphasis that we believe needs to be put when we go into these very interesting technologies. At UNESCO, what I want to just finish with a comment in terms of how we can continue supporting the global debate on this matter. because one of the functions of UNESCO is to promote the ethical advancement of science and technology to enable innovation. And we have been applying this ethical mandate to the frontier fields of science, including genetic engineering, neurotechnologies, artificial intelligence. Of course, when I was working for other international organizations, I found it very strange that UNESCO has this ethical mandate, because for me, ethics should be the business of everybody. But at the end, it's true that we have these two committees that are looking at the ethics of science and technology, and the International Bioethics Committee, with experts that are dedicated to, of course, be understanding how technologies work, but more than anything, looking at the governance of the technologies. And the governance, which again, I need to insist, needs to be inclusive, fair representative, to ensure that it's really bringing everybody around the table. The Committee on the Ethics on Science and Technology is preparing a report on the climate reengineering. It will be ready by the end of this year. We have been discussing with the experts, and of course they think that this is a contribution, as the contribution that Carnegie on their journals have been making, as many other institutions are also developing their own reports. But the report is also recommending that we continue with the global debates, and that maybe we can offer a platform to ensure that everybody is represented. So this is our contribution. We will be happy to continue seeing how things evolve, because we are now talking about solar radiation modification, but there are many upcoming, and I think it's very important that we are well aware. I remember having been witnessing all the discussions about the carbon capture and storage, which is a very, very expensive technology. And therefore, again, I hope it will not happen as it happened to us with the COVID vaccines, that those that had the recipe could use them, hoard them, 3 times be covered by the vaccines, and the rest of the world just watching without the possibility to protect themselves. And therefore, these unfair outcomes is what we should prevent, and to be conscious of the impact on all grounds that the deployment of these technologies may have. So great to be in this conversation, and looking forward to learning more with you, because I'm sure that you have many climate experts and climate technologies experts, which is always fascinating to listen. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you in particular for highlighting the ethical questions that we all have to consider when looking at these issues, including questions about who is going to participate in this discussion, the fact that it needs to be global, the lack of governance, and the number of other issues. So thank you very much for that. I don't know how long you can stay with us for the discussion. We have planned a more substantial Q&A session toward the end. But if there are any quick questions, not in terms of detailed discussion, but quick questions to Gabriela now, I would be very happy to entertain that, either from the participants here in the room or anybody online. And I will just look around and see if there are any hands. And I am looking at my phone if there are any online comments coming in. If not, then I think we will continue with the plan that we've had. So we will then not have any immediate questions, Gabriela, but you're welcome to stay as long as you can. And there will be some interesting presentations now from experts in this area. So let's move to the next part of our...
Janut, I think there is somebody raising the hands in the screen. Delaine.
Yes, Delaine. So this is Delaine, and I'm from Blue Cooling Initiative in the Netherlands. And one of the principles that I have seen the most about governance of SRM is actually involving indigenous people and local people in the discussion as one of the starting points. What is your position on that?
Maybe we also ask Benjamin to put the question and we package them and.
Sure. Thank you very much for a fascinating actual presentation, which I really enjoyed. As everyone knows, including Janos, this is a really pesky governance problem. It's not just a problem of technology, there's a problem of ethics, morality, politics. And so with your immense experience in governance, how do we solve such a multi-scalar, wicked governance dilemma, given it cuts across nation states, companies, and our usual mechanisms for good governance?
Thank you so much. I think that that's the two questions for the Len. When I mean inclusive, we really mean inclusive. It's not just to proceed to agree on a format of a table, but to really reach out to even those people that will not be the usual suspect coming to this kind of global debates, because this is what we really need to capture by engaging meaningfully with civil society, by engaging meaningfully with indigenous groups. And actually, let me tell you that we have this global coalition that is Bridges, that is exactly trying to bring innovative knowledge to the challenges we face, because sometimes we are just getting around and around with the same kind of solutions, and we're not making progress. And one of the best pool of wisdom that you can have is indigenous communities. And therefore, the question is, how do we ensure that we get the people to listen and for them to bring all what they know, because in that way we will be really covering all the grounds in a meaningful way. And this brings me to Benjamin's, and actually there is another program. It's not a program that I run, but UNESCO has in the reserves of the biospheres program that we have. There is a program that is named Links, which is actually trying to document all the knowledge that indigenous communities have for different parts of the reserves of the biosphere. But this then leads me to what Benjamin was asking: what kind of governance? And I feel that we all speak about multi-stakeholder governance, all of us, all the time. But again, is not just the title that needs to be put there, which is important, but also the mechanisms of ensuring that you again don't finish with the same people around the table talking about the same things. There are always, it would not be the first time, because we have the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, and it's more or less the same problems, because you have a high concentration of those that produce the technologies and take the decision on how to develop it. And then the rest of the world, of course, might use them, but they are not deploying them. And what is happening is that you need to make these balanced decisions, because there are always trade-offs, and we need to consider those trade-offs, and therefore to establish a mechanism that is inclusive, with representations from many parts of the world, multidisciplinary. You cannot leave this in the hands of just one discipline. It's not about the engineers, it's not about the environmentalists. Bring the philosophers, bring the writers, bring the artists, because all of them have something to say around the table, and we need to be conscious of that. But the other part is to make sure that you have the evidence to inform policies, the evidence, because at the end there's gonna be a politician, a leadership, somebody that we appoint for taking some of these decisions, but at the end it will be very important that you have all of the trade-offs. I use the example again of artificial intelligence. The code is protected by property laws, and it should, because it's about innovation and it's about investment that somebody is doing to develop these technologies. But if that specific code causes harm, then the priority is to address the harm it had caused, and therefore this protection cannot be completely a barrier to understand. So to make those connections, you need a lot of evidence, a lot of research, but also the mechanism by which you can have the people around the table to make a meaningful debate. We will be happy to continue this discussion and to see how much we can add up to the very important task that we have in front of us.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, but I think we need to move on. I see that there are some other questions. I would like to leave those to the actual Q&A later so that we can get back to our schedule. We're now a little bit delayed. So thank you very much, Gabriela. And as I said, you're welcome to stay as long as you can. Now I'd like to turn to the next item in our agenda, which is the 3 keynote presentations. First, talking about knowledge gaps and risk approaches. And we have 2 speakers here. First, Ines Camioni from Argentina. She's associate professor at the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Buenos Aires and senior researcher of the National Scientific and Technical Research Council at the Center for Atmosphere and Ocean Research in Argentina. She's also vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 1 and member of different committees and panels, including in particular the World Commission on Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology of UNESCO, about which we just heard from Gabriela, and also the expert panel undertaking the UNEP that undertook the UNEP 1 atmosphere report. So Ines, I suppose you will speak first, and then we will have Andy Parker, who will join after that. Andy has been the main architect of the Degrees Initiative, who is actually co-sponsoring this event, and the SRM Governance Initiative since its launch back in 2010. He's been responsible for the focus on the Global South, the program of engagement workshops, and the creation of the Degrees Modeling Fund. His background is in climate policy, and he began working on geoengineering in 2008. I think he's one of the early persons working on this issue, and we welcome him at this session. And he was, of course, author. Actually, you led the production of the Royal Society's Geoengineering Climate Report back in 2000. So with that, Ines, you have the floor.
Janos, thank you for having me here. And I will share this presentation with Andy. And we've been asked to cover 2 topics, one related to the knowledge gaps on SRM, and the other one on the risk framework to explore the potential impacts and benefits of SRM. And if we cover in depth all the knowledge gaps we have, it will take more than the 15 minutes we already have for this presentation. So we decided just to cover 5 knowledge gaps related to the physical science and 5 other knowledge gaps from the social political side. And let's start with the physical knowledge gaps we have. Next slide, please. And in this sense, the first question would be how much and where would, for example, SRM disrupt the rainfall patterns we already know we have in the climate system. And we know that SRM cannot optimize temperature and rainfall at the same time and everywhere. So assuming that solar radiation modification is used to manage temperatures, in fact, to cool the planet, what will it do to rainfall patterns around the world? The next question, or the next knowledge gap we have, is what new risk would solar radiation modification introduce to ecosystems? Because we know that SRM will result in significant changes for species and also for ecosystems because of changes in weather patterns, but also of changes to light quality and quantity, to chemical depositions, and what and where are the greatest ecosystem risks? The third question or knowledge gap would be how much would SRM disrupt the monsoon systems? And ever since a famous paper by Alan Robock back to 2008, that it has been noted that SRM has the potential to disrupt the monsoon systems, and many millions of people depend on food because of the rainfall associated to monsoons. And we need to understand more about what will happen because of SRM to these weather systems. And the fourth question would be, what surprises are we waiting if we start doing SRM, because it would be involved to deliberately intervene in a complex system like the climate system. And what are the side effects, the unknown unknowns that might be there waiting if we implement because of the deployment of SRM? And the last knowledge gap associated to the physical side is if the potential effects of a termination shock. This would be too risky to consider. Is, for example, if we stop injecting these particles into the stratosphere, for example, we can expect a sudden increase in temperature and the associated impacts to that.
Thanks, Inez. Moving then to the socio-political dimensions of SRM. Knowledge gap. Question number 1, will SRM draw political attention away from cutting emissions? This is the issue of moral hazard that Gabriela referred to earlier, the concern that even hearing about SRM could draw public and policy attention away from emissions cuts, which everyone works on SRM agrees are essential if we're to have any sort of sane climate future. Number 2, is SRM governable? This is an issue raised by Mike Hume in 2014 in his book. This is the idea that there are so many fundamental challenges that it might not be possible to have fair governance of SRM. Number 3, what are the security threats of climate intervention? What would happen if one country unilaterally decided to deploy an SRM system globally? Could the use of climate intervention lead to tensions, conflict, maybe even war between nations over who gets to control the climate? Kind of related. Number 4, how could we get agreement over whether to use SRM or not? How can we get agreement from 200 or so countries on whether or not to even turn the system on, let alone where to set the global thermostat? Then the fifth knowledge gap, what are the justice implications of any decision to use SRM? SRM is inherently a global technology. People will not be able to opt out if they don't like it. So what are the justice implications there? And so there you have it. There's 5 key knowledge gaps on the physical side, 5 questions on the socio-political dimensions. And I think that these 10 questions represent 2 things. Firstly, they are a very useful list of knowledge gaps around SRM. We would want to have the answers to these questions if we were to consider using it. But secondly, these 10 questions are an embodiment of perhaps the biggest problem in SRM commentary and analysis in certainly the 15 years I've worked on the topic. And why? Because SRM presents a risk situation. All of these questions are what statisticians might refer to as one-tailed tests. They are one-sided. All of the questions presented here only asked about the risks of doing SRM and not the concurrent risks of rejecting SRM and suffering a warmer world.
So let's go to the risk framework. SRM presents a risk paradigm because SRM is the only known way to quickly cool the planet, in particular in the form of injecting small particles, aerosols, into the stratosphere. And this should not be a controversial claim because it was a conclusion of the Royal Society report on Engineering the Climate that Andy worked in 2009. And 14 years later, it was the same conclusion presented by the UNEP report that Janos mentioned some minutes ago. And this means that, until such a time as global temperatures have leveled off, there will be a risk for not doing SRM, because to reject SRM means to suffer a warmer world. So there are large risks from doing SRM and also large risks from not doing SRM. So if you do risk, if you do SRM, you have risk, and if you don't, you also have risk. And this is the main issue of the risk framework, to compare these different kinds of risk. And an example, we can think also in chemotherapy, that it's a good analogy for the risk decision. Chemotherapy is unpleasant and risky, and no one in their right mind would consider doing it unless they thought that the alternative of not using it might be worse. So chemotherapy is not the right analogy for the other aspects of SRM, of the decision process of using SRM, but it is the best analogy for consideration in the risk context. And for conveying that decision around SRM is a decision between two bad or not so nice options. And with this in mind, let's look back to our knowledge gaps and try to fix them in some way. Risk, therefore, is about seriously making questions about the risk of both using and rejecting SRM as a foundation for good analysis. So we can go back to the first question related to the physical knowledge gaps we have. How much and where will SRM disrupt rainfall patterns? And in the risk framework, the opposite question to this would be, next slide, please. And the next question accompanying this first one would be, how and where do rainfall patterns change under global warming versus under SRM? In the second case, the question we have was, what new risk would SRM introduce to ecosystems? And in opposition to this, how do these new risks compare to the risk from allowing the planet to continue warming? The third question was, how much would SRM disrupt monsoon systems? And in the risk framework, the opposite question would be, how would SRM affect monsoon rains compared to the major changes expected under continued warming? The following question was, what surprises are waiting for us if we start doing SRM? And the question would be, and how do they compare to the nasty surprises are waiting for us beyond 1.5C, 2C, or 3C? And finally, does the prospect of termination shock mean that SRM is too risky to consider? And the other question would be, in comparison to that, how do the risk of termination shock compare to the risk, for example, of passing a tipping point if SRM is not used?
On to the socio-political questions. First one was, would SRM draw political attention away from cutting emissions? Balance that out. How do claims about the efficacy of any major climate policy, cutting emissions, adaptation, carbon removal, SRM, how will these affect support for other of the macro climate policies? Do claims that we are going to make 1.5C through emissions cuts alone draw necessary political attention away from the need to adapt, the need to remove carbon, and the need to at least research SRM? Is SRM governable? Is a world with SRM more or less governable than a world of 2C or 3C of warming? If so, how are they similar or different? What are the security threats of climate intervention, and how do those security threats compare to a world of 2 or 3C of warming, of mass climate migration, of potential conflict over water, and so on? How can we get agreement over whether to use SRM? Well, it's a technology that can be used unilaterally. How do we get agreement to reject SRM and to endure higher temperatures? What are the justice implications of any decision to use SRM? Again, you can just flip this over. How do they compare to the justice implications of any decision to reject SRM or to delay it and to suffer greater levels of warming? To close out the presentation, I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining what risk is and what it isn't. There are some misunderstandings over the concept and some critiques that I want to address before finishing up. Let's first of all cover what risk isn't. Firstly, risk is not about thinking that you can neatly calculate, quantify, and compare the risks of doing SRM with the risks of not doing SRM. Risk does not imply this. There will still be huge amounts of uncertainty about the risks of one path or another. But that uncertainty applies in both directions. It applies both to the risks of a warmed world and to the risks of a geoengineered world. Risk is not about promoting one conception of risk over another one. Some people have critiqued very reasonably that different cultures have very different understandings of risk and uncertainty and so on, meaning risk analysis is impossible. But it's perfectly correct that there's enormously different concepts of risk in different cultures around the world, but you can use any given conception of risk or of uncertainty in your risk analysis. Risk analysis is about asking even-handed questions about risks and unknown, rather than doing one-sided analysis, interrogating the risks of chemotherapy without concurrently thinking about the risks of cancer. Some people critiqued that doing risk comparisons means inherently using unrealistically ideal or optimistic scenarios about SRM. Risk is not about this. In fact, quite the opposite. Good risk analysis involves considering a range of different deployment scenarios for SRM, trying to understand their different implications and comparing them to different emission scenarios while we try and fill out the possible things that might go wrong, whether we use this technology or whether we reject it. I spent much of the time at the recent GeoMIP workshop arguing for the SRM modelers to include a range of different scenarios that can be compared to each other to try and avoid giving the impression that SRM does one thing when you use it. So at the heart of risk analysis, it's just making sure that questions are not grossly one-sided. Having said what risk isn't about, here's what I think it is about. As covered above, good risk analysis is about the questions that we ask about SRM and trying to avoid doing those one-tailed tasks, asking just questions about one side of the equation. It means being honest in even-handed attempts to explore the risks of SRM alongside the risks of warming and looking at different scenarios that we may consider to be more or less sensible. Unfortunately, as I think you will have worked out, risk will not tell you whether or not to do SRM. For better or worse, the only sensible answer on all of the questions I asked above, will SRM be worse for global security than a 3C world? I've got no idea. You can persuade me either way. Both look pretty horrible to me. This is about asking the question and making honest attempts to work together to answer them. And so final word, risk is not, and it cannot be, the final word on SRM evaluation, but risk is the start of any serious analysis on the topic. Janos, thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, Andy and Ines. And I must say, I found very refreshing the way you looked at the risk approach and giving it some real meaning, which I think may be helpful to all of us in the room and also those connecting from elsewhere. And it's also interesting to see how the bottom line of the risk approach and the bottom line of the ethical framework is the same. It doesn't give you a simple answer that this is the way to do it or this is the way not to do it. It gives you a frame for addressing the issue. So thank you for that. Let's move on. And our next keynote presenter is Suchi Talati. We've worked with her for many years in different contexts. She's a climate technology and governance expert and the founder and the head of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, or DSG for short. She's also currently a co-chair of the Independent Advisory Committee to oversee SCOPEX, that particular experiment that many of you may have heard about. An effort to provide oversight for the potential outdoor solar geoengineering experiment proposed by Harvard University. She most recently served as Chief of Staff of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the US Department of Energy also. So, Suchi, you will talk about stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janos. And thanks so much to C2G, UNESCO, TERI, and Degrees for having me at this panel. So as Janos mentioned, I recently founded a new organization called DSG which is focused on the intersection of the justice and governance dimensions of solar geoengineering, or SRM. And we're really thinking critically about how to empower climate vulnerable communities in deliberation about SRM. And so I decided to build this organization in the context of a few different ideals. And so first, climate justice is global. Second, governance must be early and inclusive. And third, people should be empowered to speak for themselves. And so for this talk, I'll be focusing on how these ideas come together around public engagement. Next slide. Okay. And so, we've heard a lot about kind of different facets of some challenges around SRM and governance. And so I just kind of wanted to focus on a few of these things here. And these challenges are by no means all encompassing, but are extremely important when we think about ideas around how public participation can happen. And so one of the first challenges is that the field is currently extremely global north centric. We know that this is deeply problematic, and research and governance both need robust participation and leadership from the global south, but there have been very few efforts to try and shift this dynamic. Second, as we've heard from both talks so far, is that there's extremely limited governance. We have no formal governance on the international level across the research and potential deployment spectrum. We're seeing some forms of governance start to form at the national level in some countries, but is still extremely limited. Third is that civil society is unengaged. NGOs have been unable or unwilling to find pathways to engage in the space, which has left it very empty of constructive civil society voices. Civil society is a key sector to building policy, to holding governments accountable. And so with that lack of widespread involvement, the existing narratives have led to very privileged and powerful actors speaking on behalf of climate vulnerable communities and countries. And finally, the last thing I want to emphasize is that the contentious nature of SRM is driving very unproductive discussion. It's largely the main driver of how this field is perceived, which makes it very challenging to build a legitimate discourse around governance and research. Next slide. And so I wanted to distill kind of these challenges into kind of three overarching gaps into the field, which are knowledge, participation, and decision-making. Andy and Inez both talked, very deeply around kind of the knowledge gaps. And so we know that foundational knowledge in solar geoengineering science, policy, and governance is deeply needed. This is a major gap across the global north and south. It requires a lot of resources, but we know that the ability to engage in international forums on this topic are only possible through informed sets of participants across all types of sectors and across a diverse set of countries. Next is participation. We have to build processes for robust public engagement from multiple sectors at a range of scales that will need to serve different purposes. This includes things like co-developing research and policy priorities, participating in different types of decision-making processes, and advocating for preferences. And the last thing is that we don't have any decision-making frameworks for SRM. We have to work to build equitable structures that are capable of making binding rules and agreements, but that's a huge challenge. And so all of these gaps are deeply linked to one another. The ability to achieve more just outcomes, to achieve public trust, and to achieve legitimacy in research are all deeply dependent on all of these areas. And so I wanted to take a step back to see how a lot of these terms link together. It's easy to talk about kind of the needs for engagement or participation around how inclusion, justice, and equity are very important without taking the time to understand what these terms really mean and what implementation takes. So I wanted to start with this concept of governance. And so the way I define governance is any process that affects or involves decision-making at all scales with both state and non-state actors. And so this means processes around both research and potential deployment, which requires very different processes and asks very different questions. This also engages all types of institutions and people, from researchers to civil society organizations to funders and governments. And a point I want to emphasize here is that oftentimes governance is only thought of as restrictive measures to inhibit actions or exert control. But it's important to remember that governance can be enabling, which means enabling things like public participation, enabling better versions of research. And so this all gets us to the idea of public engagement or participation as a core component of governance. It refers to approaches by which either researchers, funders, or different types of decision-making bodies can aim to inform, to understand public input, and to actually draw input from different types of publics and stakeholders. And the other word I want to emphasize here is inclusion. I think this is a word that's raised a lot in the context of public engagement. And so I wanted to define that term clearly. So inclusion means improving participation for those who have been disadvantaged, marginalized, and vulnerable through building better opportunities, building access to resources, and respecting their rights. And so IPCC AR6 stated that the co-evolution of SRM governance and research provides a chance for responsibly developing SRM technologies with broader public participation and political legitimacy. And so we have to ask questions around how these types of engagement measures occur, by whom, and what political structures and institutions will they exist in. So the needs of engagement and inclusion are deeply rooted in justice. And so justice demands the protection of basic rights, the fair treatment of individuals, and equal opportunity of all to participate in decision-making. Public engagement is a key tool to advancing justice in solar geoengineering. And so the social science literature describes 3 core reasons as to why public engagement is really critical. And so first, public engagement builds trust. This trust has been eroding quite a bit across the scientific infrastructure, and involving publics more in the way we do science can start to build kind of better bridges and better types of relationships. Second, engagement done well can advance democratic principles and fairness in decision-making. And lastly, public participation can actually build better research and develop diverse ideas. It's not just important because it's fair, but because it actually improves outcomes in decision-making. We need engagement across different communities, not just to understand how solar geoengineering would impact physical systems, but to actually understand how they impact social systems. Understanding how these physical impacts might relate to the ways people live and function is not something we understand at all. Next slide. And so I want to emphasize here that this idea of public engagement is incredibly complex. I think we often hear research institutions, policymakers, or organizations using these types of terms easily or without context. But I think it's important to name that engagement is not a singular thing. It takes careful effort to do well. And so it's going to look very different for different needs or processes. An engagement process for a specific experiment will look quite different from the engagement needed to build something like a public research program. At the same time, there's a core component of engagement that I think often gets overlooked, which is building the knowledge and capacity needed to enable that actual participation. And so building that knowledge in unbiased ways is really core to enabling people to speak for themselves in these participation processes. And that is not what we're seeing in the SRM space today. And so advancing that legitimacy really requires asking important questions about any singular type of engagement process, about who has power. So who's building and sharing information? Who's designing a process? What is it for? Who's running it? Who's funding it? These are not questions that we're engaging with yet as we build any of these types of functions. Next slide, please. So one of the most critical questions that also comes up around public engagement is around who to engage. And that the answer to that question is very deeply dependent on what a process is and what the goals of it are. But one category I wanted to focus on here is civil society. Civil society is an arena for societal deliberation, which can be different networks of groups, communities, voluntary associations, but it's distinct from the state and excludes profit-motivated entities. And so there's a really vast diversity of organizations and views across the civil society sector, and it does not function homogeneously, which is something that's often overlooked in this space. Next slide. And so I wanted to focus on civil society and why it's important to governance for a few different reasons. So, where states have been reluctant, civil society can play a really constructive role in establishing inclusive and just forms of governance in the near future. Civil society can also act as a conduit for diverse communities and groups to engage, which can broaden perspectives, values, and worldviews that are included in deliberations. And finally, governments and political institutions can be volatile. We've seen this in every country, and that can undermine the dedicated and consistent efforts needed to govern something like SRM. And so when we kind of look at what's needed for civil society to participate, it comes back to the point that I made earlier, that we're lacking knowledge in ways that actually empowers different people's perspectives. And so, thinking about how to build that capacity for governance is a really significant area of work for us. Next slide. And so I wanted to conclude about a few different points around what I think is really needed to enable public participation and to enable that contribution to governance. And so the first is capacity building across all types of institutions, across geographies, to actually enable engagement in different types of processes. The second is around empowering civil society and policymaker engagement, especially in climate vulnerable communities. We need to increase global North and South collaboration. And finally, we need more international institutions and intergovernmental organizations being willing to engage in this topic. And so I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And how shall I put it? Between the three of you and what Gabriela shared with us earlier, you're not making this easy. This is quite a challenging issue, and we don't have time to have a discussion now. And if anybody has questions, either here in the room or later, or in the online participants, please keep that for the Q&A session. We will come back to these. But what I would like to ask you to think about is how to connect these three things that we have heard, because the ethical analysis makes you raise a number of questions. The risk approach makes you also ask a number of questions, but differently than perhaps when we're used to, so it's more complicated. And then, Shuchi, you told us how different processes will require a different kind of participation, different engagement. They will look different. So how do we make this work so that we can actually advance the discussion? So think about that. But now we'll turn to the next part of our discussion, the panel discussion. So please stay here. It's okay. If I can ask Clara to join here. She is the one member of the panel two members of the panel who are physically here, and we have a number of other panelists that are joined. So I would just like to quickly check if we have all our panelists online. And if they are, please put on your video so we can see you. So we have Dr. Ravichandran from India. Are you there? Yes, you are. Fantastic. We have Dr. Gupta from the Netherlands somewhere. I hope she's there. Fantastic. We have Manish Srivastava from TERI is there. Yes, perfect. We have Ines Camioni here, and we have Clara Botto here, and we have Benjamin Sovakol, who is also there. He's doing his jogging while participating in the panel. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. So we have all of you together. So what I would like to ask is that each of you, one by one, if you could just share with us in up to a minute of who you are and why you are interested in this issue, why you're engaged in this issue, why you're here physically or virtually. So let's just do that in the same order. If we could start with Dr. Ravichandran in New Delhi, please. You have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Of course, primarily I am very much interested to know about what are the various things which you have summarized recently, risk as well as ethical and all other issues related to SRM. And basically I want to throw some light on how the possible routes to strengthen the international governance framework around SRM. That's the main thing. So I will briefly summarize later what is that my point of view there.
Thank you very much. We'll come to that. Arti, if you could introduce yourself and just say why you're engaged in this issue.
Yes, thank you very much, Janos, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm Aarti Gupta. I'm a professor of global environmental and climate governance at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I think, Janos, you asked us why we are either interested in or concerned about SRM. And I have in the last years become sort of reluctantly interested in SRM. And this interest is actually driven by a strong concern about the growing attention to SRM. And it must be said that this attention is sort of being generated still by a relatively small group of actors. And in my view, this growing attention is a dangerous distraction from, it will not help us address accelerating climate change and its impacts. It risks making the situation worse. So I'd like to, in my interventions, just elaborate on why I think SRM is both a distraction from what we know we need to, a dangerous one. So thank you.
Thank you, Aarti, and we look forward to hearing that. Ben, can you share with us who you are and why you're interested in this issue?
Yes, and apologies, I don't have a car, so I rely on mass transport, and my train was delayed 2 hours today because of rain. So one of those impacts of climate change. So I'll be in my office in 2 minutes. But more importantly, Benjamin Sovacool, Professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University, Professor of Energy Policy at the University of Sussex, and a University Distinguished Professor of Business and Social Sciences at Aarhus. And I like that those professorships kind of capture as part of the dilemma with climate policy. It's partly about environmental systems, it's partly about business models and finance, and it's of course about policy, politics, and governance. I'm really privileged to lead a large ERC grant called GENIE, which is about the governance of negative emissions and geoengineering. And it's also in the name, GENIE. Are these technologies we need to keep in the bottle, or should we let them out to deal with the risk trade-offs? And so we're taking a very socio-technical approach to understanding SRM, which includes politics, power, gender, indigenous communities, and so forth. And like Andy Parker said, I don't know if we want to deploy these options, but I do know we certainly want really well-informed discussion about them.
Thank you, Ben, and look forward to you finding your office and all that. Let's switch now quickly to people physically here. Clara, maybe you could start.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Clara. I've been working with environmental activism and grassroots movements for the past 8 years, and also representing young people in international discussions. And my involvement with SRM specifically began 5 years ago when I went to the International Symposium on Climate Engineering. I believe that was the name. And I was the only young person in the room, and that didn't shock me because I was used to traveling to conferences and being the only young person there. But because the discussion on SRM is so intergenerational, and it was back then much more of a niche than it is today, it worried me that we weren't opening the room to more voices and to teach the younger generation about those technologies. So yeah, I'll leave it like that.
Thank you very much. And Manish, if you could say a few words about who you are, and be careful because your Director General is watching you.
Yeah, thank you, Yanis. Hi, everybody. My name is Manish Srivastava. I'm a Senior Fellow and Associate Director at the Earth Science and Climate Change Division of TERI, New Delhi. My interest emerges from two angles. One is that my training is in science, technology, society studies. So this, of course, is core area of interest from disciplinary training point of view. But professionally, I have been tracking global negotiations and politics of climate change with technology and everything that comes with access, development, deployment of technology, its power politics, its justice implications. So SRM as a technological fix to climate change problem or failure of climate politics is extremely important and central. That is something that I must have a view on, which I will share later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last panelist will be Ines, please.
Janos, you already presented me. I'm a climate scientist professor at the University of Buenos Aires, and I've been working on climate change and the impacts of climate change in South America for many years. And as an IPCC author of the 1.5 report, SRM was one of the issues that was discussed in the report, and I realized that nobody from the Global South was really involved in that discussion. It was a Global North discussion among scientists from the North. So I decided that we should produce more information from our region to be part of these conversations. That's why I'm here.
Thank you very much. So let's get going. And what I would like to do is I'd like to ask a question from each of our panelists. And in fact, I would like to start by asking one question to 3 of our panelists at the same time and ask them to respond up to about 3 minutes each. And the question is, what are possible routes to strengthen international governance frameworks around solar radiation modification? And I would like to ask Ravichandran, then Arti Gupta, and then Ben Sobakol to each address this from different perspectives, up to, as I said, 3 minutes each. So let's start in New Delhi.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will basically strengthening the international governance framework around this SRM is very much essential. It is crucial to ensure basically responsible and what is called transparent research and development, and also deployment of various technology for using SRM. And some of the possible routes I envisage in this is about maybe some 10 things, 10 bullet points. So maybe first one is international cooperation and agreement. What are the international cooperation and agreement is in place, and also multi-institution. I will come back each one later. And also multilateral institutions, scientific assessment of bodies, and transparency mechanism, public engagement, and some of the things already they have mentioned in some of the keynote speak. Ethical considerations, international research collaborations, and monitoring and compliance, and also what are the various kinds of review process, and finally, what are the accountability, and also how do you use the EDA, that means equality, diversity, and inclusion in all these activities. So these are the 10 points which I want to put forth. When you talk about international cooperation and agreement, I think it is very imperative to have an international agreement, and also incorporating various guidelines and also principles and standards for various research and development activities, and also how to validate and test the various processes, and also potential deployment of various technologies, and also what are the documented mechanisms, what are the things put in place for monitoring compliance, and also what are the disputes, if anything, arise out of this. So all these things we need to put in international cooperation and agreement. So whether it is in place, or how much it is there, or what we need to keep it in there. The second point I was talking about the multilateral institutions. So basically here I was trying to strengthen the existing multilateral institutions, maybe like a UNFCCC, or maybe something new, create such similar institutions, essentially dedicated to such type of modifications, and also maybe provide a platform for various countries to collaborate on policy development, and also share the information, and also build the capacity in efforts, and also making the decision-making process. All these things we need to put in place in the multilateral institutions. And the third point, which I was trying to harp on it, is the scientific assessment bodies. Of course, various independent scientific assessment need to be what is called comprehended, and various experts from different disciplines, not only physical sciences, but various other disciplines plays an important role, not only to understand the risk as well as the benefits and what are the uncertainties, because we are going for one stream, maybe other stream, there may be some difficulties, and also including ethical considerations and various kinds which has to be researched. And of course, these research bodies maybe provide objective assessments and not only subjective, and they can inform the policy decision, scientific based policy decisions while ensuring the scientific integrity. And of course, the fourth one, I was talking about the transparency mechanism. So we need to have what are the ways as well as the risks and associated with this. And maybe we need to disclose various plans and experiments conducted and what are the data collected in various experiments. And even some of the people were mentioning about pattern changing, because one change if you are doing, some other pattern may change, like rainfall and monsoons. It is very huge impact for us. We have to look at it. So we need to have a transparency measures, and this includes public registries and also various projects and regular reporting requirements and other things. And the fifth point I was mentioning about public engagement. So we need to encourage public and through various processes with the diverse participations and considering this SRM governance issues and various public consultations or stakeholder dialogues and participatory decision-making approaches help to ensure that these social concerns are considered when maybe formulating such as related to SRM. And of course, the ethical consideration is already talked about, one of the key points that is very important. And the seventh one is research collaboration. We need to make an international effort, mainly encouraging research can foster knowledge, not only sharing, but also capacity building and harmonization of various standards and protocols. All these things we have to keep in place. And this collaborative research address the gaps, whatever they mentioned in some of the key note, some of the gaps are addressed, how we can address that, and how do we understand the potential impact of this technology while promoting and cooperating with among the various countries. And the other point is about eighth point I was mentioning about the monitoring and compliance. Of course, this is mainly establishing mechanism for various activities of SRM and ensure the compliance with the agreed all agreed guidelines, and it is very important. And this may include the regular reporting by various countries engaged in various activities of such research activities or such deployment of technology. And we need to have a verification of independent verification of processes, and also maybe like IPCC type of things, peer review mechanism to assess and adherence to the governance framework. And of course, the last but one is the review process. Of course, we need to have a periodic review, maybe to assess the effectiveness of the governing framework around these technologies. And these reviews allows for adjustment-based new scientific findings, as well as technological advancement or changing various societal perspectives. And the last one is, of course, accountability. It was already talked about in some of the keynote speaker. So it is important to have various routes. These are some of the routes which we need to have not only mutually exclusive, but rather complementary approaches we need to devise, and that can be pursued various ways sequentially or parallelly, depending upon the specific context. So strengthening the international governance frameworks around this requires a collaborative effort involving governments, scientists, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders to ensure responsible decision-making in minimizing the potential risk associated with this emerging technology. So finally, I want to make this, of course, we are trying to reduce the temperature by various SRM, but what is the mass change is going to happen? And because of that mass change, how the dynamics will change and what will be its impact, all these things we have to worry about when we talk about some of these technologies. So with this, I will stop here. Maybe I will look forward to some questions later.
Thank you very much. And since we are a little bit delayed here, I would like to move on directly to the next panelist, Arti Gupta. Again, on the same question, please share with us your thoughts. And I would like to ask all the panelists to try to keep to within 3 minutes to allow then the Q&A to happen at some later point. And those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are connected virtually, please start thinking about the questions you will ask. You can already post them on the Q&A tab of the Zoom or just make note here physically and then we'll come to them. So Arti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Yash. And I'll try to stick to the 3 minutes. And I think the question about strengthening international governance frameworks is sort of, we need to the precursor question to that is, well, what are we governing towards? What should be the objective of governance? And I think as most speakers have noted, and all SRM discussions start with, we all agree that we are facing sort of an existential crisis of accelerating climate change, and we're all in agreement there. And I think the disagreement is whether SRM will make the situation better or worse. And in my view, we risk making the situation worse. And so I'd like to just lay out reasons for why that is my perspective, and that leads then to the governance proposal. So I think the first reason, this has been mentioned in terms of when Andy and Ines were talking about knowledge gaps, that deliberately intervening in the Earth's climate systems is highly risky. There are many uncertainties. There are many unknowns, but we do know there'll be unequal regional impacts on weather, food, etc., water systems. So then the question becomes, what can small-scale research, experimentation, modeling tell us? Will it give us the answer to the question that was also posed? Will we be able to tell whether we should do it or not? How the answer to that question without, in fact, this is the kind of planetary or scale altering technologies. I mean, if you're trying to alter if you're trying to have a planetary scale effect, you need planetary scale experimentation. And that would be treating the Earth and the whole population of 8 billion people as guinea pigs. So I think that's a question, what can research tell us? What can, would we need actually to go beyond small scale experimentation to actually answer the question of risk-risk balancing? Would we actually need to engage in planetary scale experimentation? And are we willing to take that risk? The second reason why it can make the situation worse to contemplate SRM is that the nature of deployment of such a planetary scale climate altering intervention, it requires very complex decisions on where to deploy, when to deploy, for how long, for how much time, souls to inject, etc., and who will pay for any harm. So there are all of these very complex elements of deployment. And given that this would be a planetary scale intervention, we would need, I think we all agree, global oversight and global political control. Yet then the question arises that we don't have these arrangements. No fair systems of global political control actually exist, which would be acceptable both to, which would be legitimate and inclusive enough to include everyone, or else be acceptable to sort of the major powers who'd actually have the possibility to deploy like SRM, a multi-generational intervention. And I can elaborate on this. I know that's quite general, but so I think we don't have those fair systems. We can keep suggesting that we need them, but if we unpack what those might look like, we then, we come to a different conclusion. So I think in light of these above two reasons, that there could be unknowable ecological and other types of consequences of using SRM, and that we wouldn't really be able to govern deployment in a fair and inclusive manner. Then the third reason it becomes very dangerous to talk about it is keeping SRM on the table distracts us from what we know we need to do right now, which is, of course, a just phase out of fossil fuels and massive financial flows to address loss and damage. But SRM then becomes a form of delay that I think we simply can't afford anymore right now at this critical juncture in time. So here's the governance proposal. For these three reasons then, this is not just my perspective, a group of more than 450 academics worldwide are now actually urging governments, the UN and other key actors to agree on a non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to elaborate on how we think that might come about. And the key call is that we absolutely need strong public oversight right? We need global political control, and we need restrictive governance arrangements in place just to prevent us from going down a slippery slope towards technology development and potential deployment of solar geoengineering. And I'm happy to elaborate on this during the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arti, and also that you provided really a perspective that is important to hear. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues, and that you also kept to the time. So now I'd like to turn to Ben, and also on the same question of what are the possible routes to strengthen international governance frameworks. If you could share with us a few thoughts.
Yeah, happy to. And unfortunately, it is a pretty complex answer. I think I've only got 5 points, so luckily it's not 8 or 9 or 10. I think we need what I call better analytical governance. So this is better mapping of those risk trade-offs that Andy and others have talked about. It isn't necessarily just about the risk of SRM versus no SRM. It's the risk of SRM trading off within SRM pathways, within carbon removal pathways, within mitigation pathways, SDG pathways. And the IPCC and National Academies reports are kind of too infrequent. They're every 3 to 5 years or 7 years. And so I think we need, at a minimum, better information and independent, rigorous research. My colleagues at MCC have a State of CDR report that they just launched last year. Maybe we need a State of SRM report to talk about different trends and performance and risks and just cutting edge research that we need to synthesize. I can say, as my role as a lead author in the IPCC 6th assessment report, we had to synthesize more evidence this current round than all other IPCC reports combined. There's like a study every day published on SRM or geoengineering. And so it's really impossible for us to kind of keep track of that without synthetic interdisciplinary reports. I think secondly, I really affirm the need for better experimental governance protocols. When people do experiments like ScopeX or make sunsets, we've got to come to grips with ethics and a code of conduct. Third, I think we need better stakeholder governance. This would be more on the private sector, which deal with things like patents, intellectual property, control, who gets to design and deploy the technologies, who's innovating and where, and what incentives do they have. I think fourthly, we need better participatory governance. This has come up in every discussion point today, and I affirm it, which means free, prior, informed consent, broad inclusion of stakeholders, strong procedural governance mechanisms, and really good mechanisms to handle disputes and disagreements. And finally, I think we need what I've called recognitional justice and human rights governance. We need to really make sure vulnerable groups, those in the global south, smallholder farmers, women, the disabled, refugees, that the most vulnerable in society are not actually put at more risk, because the kind of history of climate colonialism means it tends to be elites who drive interventions, and it only benefits the few at the expense of the many.
Thank you very much, Ben, for these practical suggestions. And I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion, but I see an interesting evolution of thinking here. On the one hand, a number of concrete practical suggestions on how to arrange research and participation and so on, and others that where we're saying that we're putting the emphasis in the wrong place. We need to talk about something else. And let's hope we come back to this. But before we do that, I would like to turn to Manish now, and Manish Srivastava from also in New Delhi. And the question to you is, what are the possible areas for collaboration among different actors to enable learning and capacity building to strengthen international governance around SRM? Maybe how that links to some of the other topics that people have brought up already, please.
Thank you, Janusz. I would start by, some belief that I have about the word collaboration. I think a prerequisite for collaboration is equality among partners. So that I would say that underlies everything that I'm going to say now onwards. It has to be seen in the context of equity. Now, since we are talking about governance of SRM and the need for collaboration towards finding a governance solution, I would again begin with a very basic idea of governance, where I feel that any good governance is essentially about, aligning interests and building trust amongst different actors. And that has to be done in the process of, genuinely addressing the apprehensions that different actors have. So this is what we have already heard, the uncertainty or doubts about what kind of interest SRM research or deployment could serve, what kind of fears people have, both in terms of whether we would be able to actually govern it once the cat is out, or how would we compensate, or how would we deal with the negative impacts and so on. So these are important processes and questions that we would need to engage with. So clearly right now, what stands in the way of collaboration between different actors is a number of distances among them. And topmost of them, which others have also pointed out too, is the knowledge gap. Now, the interesting part is that even the same type of actors, let's say, for example, scientists or political scientists or engineers in different countries don't have equal access to knowledge about SRM technologies, what's the state and what are the possible implications and so on and so forth. So, and also, if we hear discussions among people coming from different contexts, we realize that many of them are not up to date on what have been the developments in the scientific field, in the political governance discourse on the subject. So we are kind of living in a world where there are, where this different actors are situated in different time scales. So that is a very fertile ground for creating, for having a strong mistrust. So I think the first focus of, or ultimate focus of collaborations has to be trust building. That everybody is coming with a well-meaning perspectives. And I think there are three important ways where collaboration is needed. One is transparency. And transparency not necessarily in the traditional typical governance sense, but in terms of knowledge sharing. So access to knowledge has to be extremely transparent. This means that scientists across countries should have almost similar capabilities, access to knowledge. So do the governments and interested civil society and eventually communities. That penetration of most advanced knowledge about SRM is essential collaboration. Collaboration where this is, where we should not get into that classic debate of modern science versus, traditional science kind of, or giver and taker kind of hierarchy in the knowledge systems. So that in an equitable manner, inclusive manner, transparency on sharing scientific findings. The second and related area of collaboration is building research capabilities and technical capabilities. It is absolutely essential. Those who have been interested in the history of climate change negotiations, we all know the birth of UNFCCC was born out of this gap that different countries have and still have in terms of their technical capabilities and scientific apparatus to do the research that would protect their national interest. And that is absolutely necessary. So collaboration in building research capabilities and technical capabilities is extremely important. And third, and it is partly also responding to the questions that Andy had, and I have had a privilege of talking to him a long time back, so that was perhaps in the back of my mind as well, is that the key issue is the uncertainties about implications of SRM deployment. So therefore, my view is that whenever there are uncertain implications, a dialogue or governance always requires a compensatory commitment. that kind of is important to build trust, in the sense that what happens if there are losses and due to these interventions? What covers those losses and how? These are important questions. I personally feel that one of the existing framework is that of loss and damage. Let's start, that's already an existing framework. If we use that framework to think through it, we might find some way forward. We can also build on already existing mainstream platform. But that's one framework. There could be other frameworks. So risk is another framework to think about it. So the point is ultimately that collaboration towards agreeing on a comprehensive framework to think through these questions, a framework that recognizes all knowledge gaps as well as apprehensions of and ethical considerations of all stakeholders is absolutely important. We know that in negotiations, one can take a combative approach about these frameworks. I would rather prefer that it's a collaborative, in the sense that, you know, we bring together all kinds of frameworks, encourage new frameworks to come up, and develop scenarios, framework scenarios of how things might work out, and decide and see to what extent they are viable, to what extent they fare to the ethical scrutiny, and so on. So ultimately, that's the ultimate scientific collaboration that I would suggest, which is the most important area of collaboration, is that allow many frameworks and encourage many frameworks of thinking to emerge and make them talk to each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manish. And the two words collaboration and trust have come up many times in your presentation, and they are indeed very important. And let's move on now to Ines, if I may ask you just about how to engage really a broad range of stakeholders on these issues, and why is it important to look at those issues from an ethical perspective, and how these gaps might be addressed. So please.
Thank you, Janusz. And to answer that question, I will go to the report we are preparing in UNESCO on the ethics of climate engineering. In that report, it's a draft report, it's available in the web if anybody wants to look at it. But we have some recommendations that should be the base for any conversation related to climate engineering or to solar radiation modification in particular. And the first one is the central role of the scientific knowledge and research. This was already mentioned. And this includes also to consider the different conflicts of interest that could be involved in the scientific knowledge. And transparency was also mentioned, and accountability of the research that is being done, the need of sharing of the scientific knowledge and data. And the transparency includes not only on the results of the research, but also on the funding agencies for this research. That's quite relevant too. Also the governance and the need of a global collaboration and monitoring of all climate actions, not only solar radiation modification, but also the mitigation and the CDR activities and adaptation as the other climate action that must be done in the context of climate change. And participation and inclusiveness was also mentioned, the need of participatory processes and inclusion of key stakeholders. And in this sense, it's important the participation of vulnerable communities to climate change, but also women, youth, indigenous people. And there's also a need of strengthening capacity. we need to have more people working and doing research and being part of this conversation. Education is also a key issue, and awareness of what solar radiation is and the uncertainties that are associated to this strategy, but also the uncertainties we have related to climate change. And to do that, it's also important to consider that there are different solar radiation and modification strategies with different goals. And under these strategies, we can have results that can be effective or over-effective or counter-effective. And with these different regional differences, and these differences really matter in any conversation. And in this sense, it is also important to have the Global South, as already mentioned before, to be part of this conversation and to ensure that the Global South is a part of this. We need to have data, and I'm talking here as a Global South scientist. We need to have access to data, and we also need access to tools for modeling, for analysis of the results. We need funding to overcome the technological limitations we already have. Also, it's important communication of the results we have. We need to disseminate the findings we have of our research and to ensure the policy impact of this research. And we also need capacity building and to strengthen the networks, not only north-south, but also south-south.
Thank you very much. And you raised a number of issues. One, I just want to pull out of the many important ones, but because I don't think we have heard that yet, at least today's session, this idea of monitoring the different actions, not just on sort of SRM related, but also on adaptation, on the various other climate responses, and do that together. That is potentially a very important part of governance. Now, let me come to the last but not least panelist, Clara, if you could share with us in particular how you see collaboration among actors thinking about the youth and what that can do to support better international governance around solar radiation modification.
Thank you. I think, as I've mentioned before, it's an intergenerational topic. So the first point would be, how are we discussing a technology that will be used in the future and will be governed in the future if we're not equipping those who will be part of those discussions now already? And someone raised the point of what are we governing on? But for young people, I don't think that's the question. Something will be governed, so we should be equipping those people to understand what those technologies are. And I don't think youth isn't part of the discussion because they think it's too controversial or because they don't think we should be talking about it because we have other priorities. I think it's out of ignorance. SRM discussions are not reaching even young people who are part of the environmental and climate bubble. It's just not inside those circles. And I think in the question, in the aspect of strengthening governance processes, I think education will be key when we're talking about younger generations. So capacity first, awareness raising, and then capacity building. And that goes for all of the fields of knowledge that we have. So we need law students that understand what SRM is, biology student, health. It doesn't really matter because we can link SRM to all of the different areas of knowledge that we have, because everyone in society will be impacted, is already impacted by these discussions. And I would add only one more point, which is we already have young researchers that are working on SRM, but they might not be aware that this is such a global discussion and that is inside UN, like that people in UN halls are talking about it, and in different universities around the world. I think that a lot of young scientists, they just end up working on SRM because an advisor pulled them in, or because they saw like a vacancy to do research in it. But they're still not part of the global discussion yet as well. They're doing their research or completing their studies. So I think to strengthen governance discussions, we also have to bring those in who are already looking into it. And they should also have a voice and understand that this is an interdisciplinary discussion, and that goes much beyond the lab or the classroom that they're in. So I think I'll stick to that.
You and I think another interesting dimension of this discussion is the interdisciplinarity of how these things are connected. It's not just quote unquote SRM people who need to be aware of SRM, but it is really cross-sectoral and trans-sectoral. So with that, thank you for the panelists. Now, what I'd like to, we're a bit late, but we're not badly late, so I think we can manage this. What I would like to suggest for a few minutes, if any of you panelists have a question to the other panelists' presentation and then respond to it quickly, please. If just not to have a long set of discussions, because we already have a few interesting questions coming in. I'm getting them on my phone. I'm not talking to my granddaughter or something, but collecting those questions. So and there will be a few here, and I will prioritize those who are present. So I'd like to get to a serious Q&A session. But if you have any particular questions, and that includes all of us sitting, all of you on the table. So if you have any particular questions, please do that now, and please respond to it briefly if you can, and then we go on to the Q&A. So any particular questions from, yes, Clara, please, yes.
Yeah, it was on one point that Professor Gupta mentioned, that SRM is a delay that we can have in the tables. But I've actually heard from other young activists and young people that the delay would actually not, the delay would be not talking about it, because we all know we're running out of time. And if we're seeing SRM as one more tool in the toolbox, if we refrain from discussing it openly now, then we would be losing time. I guess I would only like to hear more on your perspective on that.
Thank you. Arti, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the point about delay was, it's not so much about delaying understanding of SRM as an option, but the delay argument is that by talking about SRM, which is at the moment a speculative sort of future and potentially highly risky possibility, we would be actually, by contemplating it, we'd be delaying the kind of action we urgently need to take on, deep decarbonization, on phasing out fossil fuels in a just manner, the kinds of things we know we have to do, but are very, very challenging. And there are, we have obviously seen that we haven't succeeded in prioritizing that. Now, with our backs to the wall collectively in this critical decade and the window of opportunity closing, the question is whether we want to get distracted from that enormous challenge that we are facing, which is that we urgently need to act, and we know what we need to do to keep 1.5 in sight. And this was also the outcome of the Climate Ambition Summit. The UN Secretary General was very clear what we need to do, and that window is still open slightly. And there, I think at this critical juncture, if we introduce a speculative option which offers the future hope that there may be some way in which, that offers a potential for delay for those who may not have an interest in that deep decarbonization and phasing out of fossil fuels, because obviously there are enormous costs and there are winners and losers. And I think that's related to the question of, who's pushing the conversation around solar geoengineering, who are the winners and losers. And to me, that's not just an ethical question about who wins, who loses. Those are deep, those are political questions. So it's not just a matter of, well, the ethicists have to talk about inclusion and etc. So, but anyway, I will stop there.
Thank you. Any other questions to each other? I'm looking at the screen. I can look at the screen here too. So No? Okay. Yes, Ben, please.
Yeah, I mean, all of us have thrown around a number of different principles, right, at different scales of different import. And I guess I'm always struck with when you talk to policymakers, prioritization, they like really simple lists. So I guess to my fellow panelists, what's the single most important principle out of everything we've discussed? If you could do one thing, what is the one thing you would advise the Secretary General or the President of the European Commission and so forth?
Okay. So we have a quick one sentence max answer. Headlines. Suchi.
I mean, that's an insanely hard question. But I would say talk about it.
I would say that my single priority is capacity building and expertise. I would much sooner have a cohort of experts in every region of the world who understood SRM and were on top of the evidence, and the policymakers don't know about the issue, than the flip, where the policymakers hear about the issue, they panic about it, but there's no expertise in their bureaucracies. So first, build capacity.
Okay, well, I would say transparency for governance, and for any conversation, we need transparency. And this necessarily includes to have everybody on the conversation on the table. So inclusiveness is the other thing.
Yeah, I would say finding your responsibility in this discussion. What is your role to play? I think we should start from there.
What is our role? Okay. Arti?
Yeah, I would say we need to look into, who's pushing for this conversation before we build capacity, etc. Do we want to spend scarce resources? And they are apparently scarce because the loss and damage fund is a huge fight right now. There's not billions of euros or dollars flowing into it. So do we want to spend scarce resources and attention to talking about SRM? Where is this push coming from? And if you talk about the climate justice implications of it, would unpack. Where is, from whose perspective, who's asking for the conversation around SRM? It is still a very small group. It's dominated by the global north. It's a few tech investors, and it's a few well-intentioned climate scientists. It is not a widespread conversation. It is not in the mainstream. United States, of course, but it is still a very small, relatively speaking, group. And as for civil society, etc., it's not in the mainstream. And if there's been any opposition to SRM so far, it has come from, the only small-scale experiment was actually opposed by indigenous people. So I think we have a lot of aspirations, what should be, what could be, inclusiveness, but if you look at what actually is, then we have a different analysis. And I think that is a very crucial question. Do we have confidence that, climate governance for the last 30 decades, three decades, years, has not been fair and inclusive and just? Why do we think it will be different for SRM?
I think that was a very important, but more than one sentence. So I'd like to come to Ravi, if you could address this.
Just I have only one thing is, actually, before we venture into anything, we need to know the uncertainties and what is its implications. According to me, as of now, we don't have that knowledge enough.
And Manish?
Well, I would say transparency about everything that other panelists have said. That's the most important thing.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, like we're heating up the discussion. That's great. That's what this is all about. So I'd like to go to two questions here in the room. In the back, you already raised your question before, so you have your opportunity. Please introduce yourself, and can we get a microphone to...
Thank you. I think everyone in the room can hear me. My name is Sam Block. I'm an author. I'm writing a book about climate adaptation. So I'm a little new to the SRM space, but I tried to talk to some experts. I actually went to a couple Make Sunsets launches in Mexico and the United States. And a quick question for everyone who's on the panel, I guess. I'm personally trying to find maybe for me intellectually, like a precedent for how this might go. You know, is there a policy or a treaty or a piece of legislation that might be a good precedent for SRM, one that, you know, enables action as opposed to limiting it, which I think Shuki had brought up, but also includes Global South actors in a meaningful way. You know, in my head, I'm thinking this could be something like a Montreal Protocol that phases out, you know, the coolants that are in all the air conditioners and such, but maybe that's a bad example. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, please.
Okay, could I suggest that maybe not everybody answers, because then but if you have some concrete suggestions, and I see Shuchi already responding, so please go ahead. And if there are others in the panel who have specific points, Ben has something, then please do. So
thanks, Janusz, and thanks for the question, Sam. I think one of the most important things for me as I've kind of delved into this space and been researching it is that all the precedents that we've set before have also been in the context of colonialism and elitism. And so as we think about what ideal governance could look like, I don't think there is a precedent, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think we have an opportunity to actually build something new. And I understand that, you know, thinking about an idealistic form of governance is, you know, considered naive, but I actually think it's a huge opportunity because it doesn't exist yet. So why not think about what an ideal system could look like outside of the context of climate governance? Because in my opinion, climate governance has been a total failure so far. So I don't think we should be looking to past precedent.
Ben?
Yeah, the Montreal Protocol is kind of considered the best single example of an environmental governance protocol, and there's a lot of things it did. I've heard discussions about the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, has a lot of problems, has a lot of faults, didn't really engage a lot of Global South countries, but at least it was about responsible use and technology sharing. And my colleague Peter Newell at Sussex has even used it as a template for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which would have different mandates about responsible use, technology transfer, capacity building. So I would say at least the NPT is getting about prohibitions and kind of norms about responsibility.
Thank you. Then I would like to go to the next question. Here, you have the mic in front of you.
So I'm Suruchi
yeah.
Bhadwal, and I'm with TERI, based out of India. Okay, so a couple of thoughts while I was listening to the panel having this discussion. And my first question would be, and it's not to say that I'm, you know, phrasing the question in that manner, do we need SMR at all? You know, starting off with that question, why do we need this, you know, technology to come into place? And the reason I'm basically raising it as a question is because a couple of days back when we had the New York Climate Week and we were attending a particular meeting, there was one of the persons who'd been associated with the IPCC since the 1990s. And he had made a remark that when we started talking about this issue and this topic, we did not know much about it. And the initial set of simulations that came out with regard to global change in the climate and temperatures were as high as 6.4 degrees centigrade and 5.8 degrees centigrade. And today, have we made a difference? The answer would be yes, we have, because we are not talking about 5.8 degrees centigrade change by the end of the century. Possibly it's going to be much lower than that because of the level of ambition that the world has shown with regards to what they can do. So there are changes that are happening. There are countries that are committing, and there is technology that is being put in place. So where does SMR fit into that whole discussion when we already can see changes happening and we are moving towards a direction where we are pushing that change? Maybe not at the same pace that we want to, but ideally we have brought it down at least to half of it. So that's the question. The second part is with regards to thinking about, and we were, you know, having several meetings around with different people around while we were here over the last 8-9 days, was about getting in machine learning and AI in the whole process. So don't go for experiments. And if lab experiments cannot be talking about experiments at the global scale, can we kind of compile all the information literature out there through the machine learning and the AI methods that we have to be able to talk about what kind of impacts would this basically result in? So enhancing our understanding, the science around it, through machine learning and AI. So there are opportunities there. And of course, we do have the methods and the techniques around us. So could we kind of use them? And last but not least is the point about having a special report like the IPCC, focusing on SMR, trying to answer all these questions and trying to get all these arguments that we're having over here and the discussion that we're having here together.
Thank you very much. So the real question here is a bit linked. The first question was linked a little bit to what Artie was talking about, is why bother if progress is good enough, wasting resources and maybe delay other actions that we will need to do. So if any of you would like to answer that, then the role of AI, that's a very interesting one. in helping us in that, and the third one about the potential special report of the IPCC that could then perhaps clarify some of the questions that were also. So who would like to, Andy, you would like to, you have a mic.
Well, I'll have a crack at the first question. I'm going to leave AI for someone else because I don't know anything about it. Why we should look at SRM, it's because good climate policy is about risk management, because there's a whole lot of uncertainty in the climate system and ahead of humanity. The climate action tracker is the single figure that I use to introduce the rationale for researching SRM. And it's not the high point of that I point to. So we might end up at 3.5C or 4C if we keep emitting a business as usual. But as you point, we're starting to bend the curve, and there's real reasons for optimism. It's actually the low point of the climate action tracker that really worries me, that we, humanity, could do everything that's necessary to make 1.5C. And if we get unlucky with climate sensitivity, then we still end up at 2.3C of warming. And so the reason that I work on SRM is not because I like the idea, because I'm a techno-optimist, but it's out of concern about what we face if we get unlucky with climate sensitivity, or if we just don't do enough to avoid warming. So what is the plan for managing warming above 1.5C if we get unlucky?
Artie, you have your hands up, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I don't seem to have the hand sign. But yeah, I would just like to maybe ask Andy, what if we get unlucky with SRM? Because, this risk balancing idea, I mean, in theory, it sounds very, that's that kind of framing. I mean, what worries me is that will we ever be able to do that risk balancing enough to know that, okay, in sum, the risk balancing equation comes out this way or that way without actually doing SRM for some extended period of time in order to even know the answer to the risk balancing, because as you said, there are all of these uncertainties. And so therefore, like you said, also in your presentation, well, I have no idea actually what the answer will be. So we can pose the question, but are we willing to take the chance with the answer? Or should we rather do what we know is, well, it's, it's very, very politically and economically difficult, the alternative, the deep decarbonization and mitigation, but at least it's not introducing new risks into the climate system in that sense.
Okay, Andy, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I agree on almost everything that you said, Artie. The one word that you used that I disagree with, you said alternative, and I don't think we should think of SRM and mitigation as being alternatives. We very obviously have to do everything we possibly can to cut our emissions. But it's my view that we also, given where we are, given the trajectory and given the projected risks, we have to also understand what our options are if we fail to cut emissions far enough, fast enough. That doesn't mean doing SRM. You mentioned that to test SRM would be to do an experiment that's global. Risk to not test SRM, to allow the temperature to keep ticking above 1.5C, 2C and beyond, is equally doing an experiment that is subjecting everyone on the planet to. And so the one thing I feel confident about is that when it comes time to make the decision, we will be better off having done the research, having had the conversations and having built the governance arrangements than if we just give up on the idea now, cross our fingers.
Thank you. And I there are clearly differences of view there. So maybe one more question from the floor, please. And then I'd like to go to the interesting questions that we have collected from.
Yeah, thank you. And
the
it's
world.
really not a question, because what we are essentially doing is it has become a debate, and that's the way it should be with the new technologies. Well, whether we are talking of 1.5 degrees, 6 degrees, what Suruchi just mentioned, even with 1.5 degrees, the world has changed, and it's the uglier face of climate change. The impact is far uglier than what was depicted in IPCC reports. We can't even afford 1.5 or 2. As a scientist, I feel we have to explore every possible opportunity. We are not saying that SRM is going to be the technology for the entire globe, maybe for some regions, because where the temperature increase even of 0.5 degrees is going to be too much. Over there, why not? But having said that, we are talking of a technology which is going to have impact not only on this generation, maybe future generations as well. So we have to be extra cautious. We have to carry out a sort of audit. What are the risks? And really speaking, to know what the risks are, perhaps it is because all said and done, as scientists, we also get biased to what we are doing. And we say nothing is going to happen. And therefore, stakeholder consultations becomes extremely important. Let them ask the questions which we haven't thought about. So for that, it's very important that people understand the technology. Transparency in communication is essential. Involve them in decision-making, because it shouldn't be top-down approach, because even if you're doing a great technology and you're just taking last day to the public, they will say they have the technology and they want to commercialize. They won't see merits in it. So have their involvement. And I'm not saying that it's going to succeed, but if we are very transparent, rather than investing billions of dollars and all that, it is that let's look into acceptability, taking risk into consideration. So that to me becomes important. We must go outside, because otherwise we are just talking amongst ourselves and we are very positive of the technology and so on. What is required is also that at least we do pilot, because it shouldn't be just at the lab scale and we are saying this technology can be taken up. Global collaborations becomes extremely essential, and strong governance, because then everyone should have confidence that it is well governed. In that, you need to have buying from the various governments as well. So therefore, whether one likes it or not, it becomes a global kind of a project with buying from various countries, various stakeholders. And we also have to look into the accountability aspect, because it shouldn't be that everyone, the countries which even today are struggling, they are the ones who suffer all the most because of this. Transparency in scientific findings and sharing capacities, that is extremely crucial. To me, the events of this kind are great, highlighting the issues and discussing. But if we really want to make it more meaningful and more inclusive, we have to get out to, I should say, at various country levels as well, and have these discussions and create a sort of institutionalized platform for dialogue and research. Put all the data over there so that people can read it. And the research, giving research inputs and or the involvement of scientists from various countries will be essential. And that's what I'll say, that create a platform for discussions. And we'll be happy to be part of that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dhawan. And just for those of you who don't know, Dr. Dhawan is the Director General of TERI. And actually, it seems to me this was less of a question and more of a closing remark. But we do have a few questions that we still want to address. So if you can bear with us, I would like to go to the questions we received online. And there were a number of questions from Dalian Bourgeli and also Mark Milne. questioning why are we just talking about essentially stratospheric aerosol injection. There are various other interventions that can change the albedo, including nature-based intervention and others. Some could be more effective than SAI. So that's one question I would like the panelists to address, because I think it's very important. Then another question from Mike McCracken, where, and I will actually read this because just to make sure that we get this right. So he's saying that the debate seems more appropriate to the 60s, when geoengineering was proposed to remake the global climate, than the 2020s, when the intent of geoengineering, SRM, is to try to keep the climate to the norm that the world presumably prefers. Right now, more people are dying and being impacted by climate change than by the pandemic. It seems to me that a useful analog to developing the vaccines for the pandemic, where the approach has been to develop as rapidly as possible and go through all the various issues being raised, addressed in a learning and adjusting as doing. Otherwise, I wonder if it will be possible to get through all of the issues in time to make the difference that can help to prevent many irreversible consequences and losses of life. So I read this in full, but I think it'd be interesting to look at that. So please, panelists, think about that question. And a little bit related to this, but also from Dalian, given the urgency facing the global south, could we find a path to gathering all existing governance research, of which is not a little, and entering a discussion with participation of key IGOs like the World Meteorological Organizations and First Nations? Interesting question. And then the last one I have is from an anonymous participant, but it's a rather interesting one. Thoughts on how to ensure governance frameworks could extend to non-state rogue actors looking to deploy SRM, e.g. billionaires looking for a quick techno fix. So I think that's what I have, and what I'd like to suggest, given the time that we have, is that in any order, if you can address one or more of these one after the other, and then I think with that we will be able to complete the session. So I see, yes?
Sorry. I can start with the first one. Why we are talking about SIR, stratospheric aerosol injection, instead of the other technologies of solar radiation modification, and it's because it's the only one that can cool the planet. When we are talking about the global temperature in a few years, and the other technologies, marine cloud browning has a regional impact. Cirrus cloud thinning, we don't know much about this. We need more research, and this is why stratospheric aerosol injections, when you consider feasibility and effective, how effective could be, is the technology that we can think about using in a shorter period of time to cool the whole planet.
Yeah, just to engage with the question from Mike around kind of the level of conversation. One thing I just want to caution is thinking about kind of the context of framing and kind of the way we often speak on behalf of others in an SRM conversation. We don't know what the impacts will be, but we do know that most people are not involved in this conversation. And so we don't actually know what people might want. And so to say whether or not solar geoengineering could do things for certain people is not something I would recommend doing before talking to those people and seeing kind of how they actually are engaging with this topic and engaging with these types of conversations. And then just to kind of quickly address the last question, which was, right. I mean, I think that just gets to kind of the critical nature of governance and actually building something that has accountability and consequences. And I think that gets to kind of my comment before about kind of the failure of climate governance. We have nothing with teeth. We have nothing that actually has consequences for people who need to take responsibility. And so I think that gets to kind of a reimagining of an actual strong agreement about what people can and can't do.
Thank you. And I see Ben, and then I see Manish. So first, Ben, please.
Yeah, I like all of the questions, but I'll just kind of delve into the first two. Yes, the National Academy's report wasn't just stratospheric aerosol injection, it was also marine cloud brightening and cirrus cloud thinning. That kind of shows the top three, so to speak, feasible options. And I had the privilege of visiting the Great Barrier Reef last year, where they are doing fogging and shading to do reef protection there. And we have a piece coming out in PLOS Climate about land-sea interactions and the way that those interact with things like forestry and nature-based solutions. I think it also gets into a broader notion of these risk-risk trade-offs, because as I mentioned earlier, SRM interventions and all three of those types can conflict with carbon removal and nature-based solutions. For instance, cloud seeding, aerosol injection could affect photosynthesis, could affect solar energy production, so you're affecting mitigation efforts. So I think we got to kind of expand, unfortunately, the lexicon of risk-risk trade-offs to be very broad, to include mitigation, adaptation, and even development pathways like the SDGs. To the second question about it feels like the 1960s, it does. And it's interesting, if you want a historical analog, there's weather modification and cloud seeding, which the US military tried to do and has since been outlawed by different conventions. So you can kind of look there about how we have kind of been here before in the 50s and 60s, and we did try to change weather patterns through the military, and you could see the different stakeholders involved and why that didn't work. Ends up being a very blunt, messy weapon that you can't really use with precision. We tried it in Vietnam, we tried it in Cuba. So you could look there for a nice 1960s analog.
You and Manish, and then Arti.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the last question about regulating private actor players. I think this is a big elephant and which is hidden in the discourse. We how do we hold accountable the big private sector players and their interventions that affect global commons? That is something that has not been adequately addressed or resolved. Or perhaps it has. This question hasn't really been properly asked on the governance platforms. One of my students at TERI School of Advanced Studies in her PhD thesis is exploring this question, asking how do we regulate the environmental justice question in the outer space, because there is a lot of debris that is getting accumulated and which can have very significant implications. And now the outer space is also seemingly open for private interventions for different, in different ways. So how do we look at these questions? And first of all, the international law is absolutely silent to give any clues about how do we deal with these questions. So it is important to think about these questions, because the private players are actually becoming very bigger in many cases, probably bigger than some governments also in their ability to take actions, which may have transboundary implications. So connecting the states with the private sectors, and again, in this question, it seems more plausible from international law perspective that thinking about liabilities and how private sector's liabilities could be associated with the state's liabilities is a way to think about it. Of course, as I said, there could be other ways of thinking about things, but I think that's a very important question, and perhaps that is also one justification why we should begin thinking about governing SRM, because we do not know how its deployment would be would roll out, who would have control over these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish. And Arti, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think a number of things, maybe very quickly on the point about what Suchi was saying, that, groups haven't been asked, let's not assume and speak on behalf of others. And I just want to make the point that when groups of actors do consider SRM, usually what we do have right now, we have a lot of assessments and studies saying what could or should be the case. But what we actually have in terms of governance, it's not a completely missing global governance. We whatever we have is restrictive at the moment. So we have the CBD, we have the Mexican Declaration, and we have essentially also, I mean, if you look at, for example, the African Council of Ministers in August 2023, just last month, came out with, in terms of their input to COP28, they were very, very cautious about SRM. When they first started, it's not something that's being mainstream discussed, but as soon as you start to contemplate it, so then we have to ask the question, who is speaking on behalf of the, the most marginalized, those at the forefront of climate change? Well, the African Council of Environmental Ministers is one such body, and they have used the language of, non-use, very cautious, very concerned. And so I think the other point is that, let's think out of the box. If you're like, as Suchi again says, climate governance is failing, let's think out of the box. But I think we need to figure out, what that nature of the deployment challenge would actually be when we think out of the box. So if you're talking about thousands of specially fitted aircraft flying 24/7, and we're talking about for a century, multi-generational, and that's what temporary actually means. How would we manage that in global intervention over a century? Who would be the one taking those decisions? I mean, we have a one vote UN decision-making system. So, I mean, I think that we need to think about, if we think outside the box, we might say, well, one person, one vote, but that would give the United States 4% of the vote, 4.3% of the vote. Would that be acceptable? Would a country be willing to put their planetary altering technologies under the control of some sort of inclusive and just global governance arrangement? What other kind of thinking out of the box could we do where we could imagine such an inclusive system, which would be acceptable to the great powers? So I think those are some of the, then we would be, just coming to the future generation point, we would actually be locked. We could ask the question, should we deprive future generations of this option? Or we could ask the question, are we locking in future generations into a solar geoengineered world that we have slid into because we went from technology development to deployment, and that then we are locked into that. So that's a moral question for future generations. They would have perhaps no option but to continue that, or to be faced with the consequences of that. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. And we have 5 minutes left now. I'm in a bit of a difficult situation here, but just to be clear, so Dr. Dhawan, we actually envisaged that you would come up here and do your closing remarks, but you've kind of done that already. But if you want to say anything else at the end of this session, then this is the moment to do that. And then because and I won't say anything more yet. I would like to say a few words as well at the end, but if you want to say a few more words as we wrap up this very, very rich discussion, I think this is the moment. So if you could just...
No, that's okay.
We may have different perspectives, but we're together.
That's right. Well, first of all, I'm very glad because I'm attending it in person. We were here for the Climate Week, and then a few universities we visited. So, and that it's not one way, it is more of that it has turned into a debate, and that is what is required. Because we really don't want to listen to those who are for the technology, because what are the apprehensions? As a scientist, I still feel that we have to explore various options that can be developed, because climate change is such an issue, and we have to find solutions. Rightly mentioned, we are moving in the right direction. There are commitments from the countries, and I'll say perhaps every stakeholder in India's own program life, that every stakeholder has to contribute towards a cleaner climate. Technologies are needed, but we have to learn from our past experience that, and also today we have ability to look into what are the risks associated with it. So risks, and maybe even for those risks, if we do proper research, we can minimize those. But we need to ask these questions while we are starting with it. proper communication and stakeholders involvement becomes essential. And I'll go back to some of the examples. Like if we look at GM technology, because we never properly communicated, the technology is not where it should have been. And in many cases, it also became top-down, that the companies are ready with the technology and they want to disseminate those. While on the other hand, if we had involved right from the beginning, the stakeholders, we could have succeeded. And as science also, we could have contributed much more, because what we require today is the crops which can grow with the extremes of temperatures, humidity, and so on. So there might be regions in the world where even 0.5 degrees will make a lot of difference in the way people can live or not live. And there, on some scales, the technology can be adopted. But very rightly, and we have to look at each and every angle, what is going to be the impact on the photosynthesis, food security, and so on. So once we do that, and as I said, we need to create platforms where these issues should be debated all the more. And all the entire science that should be available for people to refer to and add further on it. That's what I'd like to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davan. Thank you for co-sponsoring this event and working with us to make it happen. The same to the Degrees Initiative and of course to UNESCO. But I will not go back to all the issues that were raised because this is a very, very rich discussion. I would, however, want to share with you certainly one element that came out of all of our discussions which C2G has been having for the last 6-7 years. With governments and with also lots of civil society organizations that I don't think I've met any government representative who said we should not talk about this issue. The debate is there, the issues are there, and there are very big differences in approach. That's the nature of this controversial and very complex situation that we're in. So I think that's fair enough, but at least this is something that I'd like to share, that we have not heard government representatives who said, no, we should not talk about this because something else will happen. Of course, government representatives, others are worried about the potential moral hazard of engaging in doing something and then not doing what we have to do, the emission reductions, which are the #1 priority, but it is not necessarily of this or that, which is what we are hearing. So this debate that we've had here today is very important. It has raised many of the tricky and challenging issues that we're facing in different ways, and this debate will have to go on, and we have to find ways to understand better. But what I would also like to understand is that most of the science from IPCC, the expert group from UNEP, what they are saying is that at this point, the science is simply not strong enough, not good enough to either accept or reject this technology. So then the question is, should we at least find out whether at some point we will be able to accept or reject this technology based on good evidence and not just good evidence from a scientific perspective, but also good evidence from the different stakeholders that all of us around this table and in virtually have said that this needs the input of the range of stakeholders. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you to all of the panelists physically here and also online. Thank you for the participants who were here. And thank you to the organizers who co-hosted this event. And there is a lot to do. So let's move on. Thank you very much.